Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back again to another episode of As I Live and Grieve. I tell you this almost every week, but I just want to reiterate, I'm so happy that you join us on these episodes. You have no idea that you are giving me a gift. Now, maybe you're getting something from the podcast episodes, and I do hope you are, because I certainly am, but you also are giving me a gift, and that's your gift of support. And I can't tell you how much that means to me. I treasure every single one of you deeply, wherever around the globe you may be. So today, another fascinating guest. I know you're going to love this one. This is some exciting, inspirational thoughts for you. And I encourage all of you to listen closely. And then one of my favorite things is to re-listen to the episode another time and get other little tidbits. With me today is Diane Wyzga. Diane, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Kathy. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, absolutely. I've really looked forward to this conversation for a while. So let's just get on with it. Would you start out, Diane, by just telling our listeners a little bit about your background?
Well, I am a backpacking, beekeeping, gardening, bread baking, Camino walking woman who was the eldest 7 children. Grew up in a middle-class home in South Jersey, found my way over to the West Coast. See, I served as a U.S. Navy nurse for a couple of years, taking care of children, working with some of the finest doctors and nurses this country could provide. I went to law school, graduated cum laude. Lord knows how that happened, but I think it was because I was channeling my mother, who said, if you're going to do anything, do it right, which meant, you go up for the highest bar that you can. I eventually established a litigation consulting practice where I was helping lawyers who represented plaintiffs, the injured parties, so that we could better tell their stories to juries, judges, juries, and insurance companies and get settlements on behalf of the people whose negligence caused their various injuries. And little by little, I found my way up to the great state of Washington. I washed up on Whidbey Island. It's the skies are usually blue. Today, we have that typical Pacific Northwest weather that's cold and cloudy, but there are eagles and deer, and there was a Cooper's hawk on my back deck the other day. And up here, I established a podcast and Quarter Moon Story Arts. So my work and my life seems to follow 3 key values, and that would be adventure, justice, and self-expression. How's that?
Well, that's a fascinating background. It really is. I love it. I definitely hear the adventure in your experience and the justice.
Yeah.
Tell us more about the expression, about storytelling.
Oh my, that's a great question. I did not grow up in a family of storytellers. So in my family, and come to find out, looking back, so I'm doing some genealogy and come to find out some of the stories in the background, just how my parents grew up in the Great Depression and the things that my grandparents achieved by coming over from Poland when they were in their teens and coming through Chicopee, Massachusetts, instead of Ellis Island. So learning more about my ancestors, my people, but they would not really talk about. They came from that generation that said, my life is my life and it's nothing special.
Right.
And so even though I had uncles who were in Pearl Harbor at the time of the bombing, no one really talked about it. But there was something about the idea of story that has always appealed to me. And over time, I began to explore it and become involved in it more and more and started taking lessons and workshops and whatnot from story mentors. So I've been involved in story for about 30 years. And I've found that throughout the course of my life and professions, there has always been an opportunity to use story, to invite story into our lives. And as you said, in the very beginning of this podcast, when you were thanking your listeners for the gift of their presence, you were reminding me that a story needs 3 parts. It needs a teller, it needs a listener, and it needs a story. And when you bring those 3 components together, then you have the art, the actual art and the craft of story. So by your listeners being there to support and encourage you and your guests, they are actually forming one of the elements of the story that you are putting out on the airwaves.
Well, and I don't know, to me, the listener is probably the most vital. I mean, at some point, it's always fun to think about our stories in our memories, but there is so much more purpose when there's someone listening to it or reading about it. In the case of if someone has told their story in writing form, when someone takes the time to sit and listen or to sit and read and absorb your story, that's the link to me, isn't it?
There's a witnessing that takes place when that happens. So when you were telling me the story earlier of the maid of honor and her dress, there's not only an enjoyment of the story and a witnessing of the telling of the story, there is also something that's going on in the listener's imagination, because hearing you tell the story, there are images, some very clear images came up. There are sensory impressions, and then there are our own memories that percolate and come back up again. So it is a very active relationship. It's a very, and I would say story, because it's alive in my world. It's alive, it's living, it's organic. Then there is that notion of something that is like wine. It's living, it's breathing, it'll follow you home, it'll sleep in your bed. And that, to me, is the way in which we are working now. We're not putting a pretty blonde on the hood of a Chevrolet and saying, here, this is how we're going to sell this car. No. Story is much more attentive. It's attentive to life, and it's connection. It's stories like sinew, I guess, the sinews in our body that hold, everything together.
That.
Otherwise, that's what it is. Story is sinew between you and I, between you and your listeners, and in the world.
I like that. Now, I suspect that somewhere in our audience, someone is thinking, wait a minute. This podcast is about grief. How does storytelling connect with grief?
Oh, boy. Well, you and I could talk from here until tomorrow. My front porch is always open.
But let's make the connection for the audience.
A short answer is that when we share the stories of those who have gone before us, we keep them alive. We keep them alive in our memories.
Absolutely.
I walk with my dad, and I talk with him about what I'm seeing, and I listen for him. When we are at a memorial service or eulogy, reading someone's obituary, we are witnessing a life that has been lived and is passing out of our human awareness into memory. So it's still there, but it's in a different form. So the ways in which we talk to the dying and the ways in which we remember those who have died helps with our grief, because there is an element of them that is still with us. Definitely. So that would be it. So that's my take. What might be your take on it, Kathy?
Well, mine is very similar. And there's a quote out there, and every time I'm reminded of a quote, I never have it in front of me. But someone somewhere said that as long as you speak their name, they shall always be alive in your heart.
Yes.
Something
Absolutely.
like that.
Yes.
And I know myself, after my husband Tom died, there was a period of time when I wasn't really in touch with relatives or friends or the normal community that he and I had been involved in. And then after that, it was kind of a dark period for me. I was just very, very sad. And then I ventured out, thought I'd be brave because I didn't want to live like that for the rest of my life. I ventured out to the group of veterans that Tom had been so close with. He was retired Army, served in Vietnam, and he was a member of the local Vietnam Veterans of America. And at their monthly meetings, they always had well over 100 members there. We used to go all the time, every month. But then this was probably about 6 months or so that I had not gone. And I walked in that room that night, and the first thing that happened was that many of the members, the vets, his brothers in arms, so to speak, came over and just threw their arms around and just embraced me. How are you doing, Kath? How are you? We've missed you. And then over the course of the evening, once the business meeting was over, we always sit around and have coffee or something like that. Generally, they would talk about themselves, about parades, about upcoming events. That evening, they traded stories of Tom. I can't tell you how that literally changed my life. I went home filled with love. And even to this day, that particular memory brings tears to my eyes. Then it kind of made it a point. Everywhere I went, there was always something that reminded me of Tom or something. And other people, I think, started to bring up, oh, Tom would have enjoyed that. Or anybody want the hot sauce? And we always laughed because that was Tom's favorite. So storytelling for me in relation to grief can not only make his memory alive, but it made me feel alive again too, because it brought back that connection, that love that I still had for him, even though he wasn't there. My love was and is still there. So I think storytelling is extremely important as related to grief, not only for the person grieving to tell those stories. They might be stories that no one else has ever heard, but also for those supporting that grieving person to tell those stories and bring that person back to life, even if only for a moment.
Your willingness to go to that meeting and be there and take part in all of the stories about Tom then served the same purpose for all of his friends. It opened the doors to them to be able to say, is it safe? Because oftentimes we don't know. We don't have the words. And we don't know what to say to someone. And it's just lame to say, well, they're in a better place, or at least they're not suffering. It's lame. Yeah. And so by you being there with them, and then those doors, those gateways, those floodgates opening up, each person in their own way was sharing in and healing grief. And I can't help but think of the ripple effect of that. So as each of those people felt a little bit more filled up with love and affection, as you were saying about your experience, how that would translate as they went into their homes. How did that sensation of whatever they were experiencing lift up something that was going on in the family? How they treated a spouse, how they reacted to a child, how they spoke to a coworker. It is like a really big rock that goes into a really big pond, and there is no end to it. And we will never know how what we've said, how we've said it, the story we've shared has helped someone else. The one thing I love to say is the end of a quote by C.S. Lewis, where he says, what, you too? I thought I was the only one. And that's why we do what we do. That. Because, it's about friendship. I thought I was the only one.
You're absolutely right about it opening the gate or the door for them as well, because I know myself, when you go to calling hours and then you see that same person maybe in the grocery store or something, the last thing you feel comfortable doing is mentioning the name of the person who died.
Right.
But from my perspective, that brought me so much joy when someone mentioned Tom's name, that I need to really be conscious of that and remember that. And when I encounter someone who has lost someone, to try to maybe encourage them to talk about that person, encourage them to tell me some stories, tell me some memories, because I need to remember what it did for me personally.
Yeah. So you're paying it forward.
Yeah.
You're paying it forward by witnessing.
You really are. You really
and you're witnessing and you're being witnessed. And so you're witnessing the grieving person and they're being witnessed. And so it keeps going like that.
Right.
There's and before I sat at my mom's bedside before she died. And I remember holding her hand. She had gone into a coma, and there's a lot of research that says that even though people are in a coma, they don't look like they're responding. In a large percentage of people, they have figured out that there is receptivity. They're actually hearing.
Hearing is the last sense to go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting there and holding her hand and telling her about what I remember growing up and the different thing, what a daughter would say to a mother.
Right.
And there was a moment in time where I said, we will keep telling the stories and we won't forget. We'll always remember. And I felt her hand squeeze mine. Probably totally impossible in her condition, but you know what?
Right.
It was there and I felt it. And I said, if that's your way of saying goodbye, then I'll see you on the other side.
Nice.
And her hand went limp.
Yeah.
And her spirit just went out the window. It was a summer night up the river and she was gone. And so even before we get to the point of them having departed this life, there might be opportunities to share story.
There was,
as they are on their way.
Yeah.
Something to smile about.
Yeah, I did something similar with Tom. Happened to go into the facility that morning, and just the way he was breathing, I sensed this was the day. So I just kind of perched on the edge of his bed and just talked to him, talked about things we had done, places we had visited. I got him to go on his first cruise because he was terrified of water. And I talked about all those things. And then I laughed, and I did insert in there, I want you to know I'll be okay. You've done a good job of preparing. I'll be fine. I'm independent. And then I laughed and I said, you always said I'd have the last word. And I said, but don't worry. Everything's fine. I got this. I got you. And then he took his last breath, But I know that when he did take his last breath, he knew I was with him. He knew that I, too, was remembering all the fun we'd had and all the good things. Let's go through another perspective.
Sure.
As we tell stories, as we gather around the family table for, Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, or we're just sitting there to picnic, let's remember to tell stories and memories about those who have died when there are younger generations present. And the reason I say that, and I'd love your take on it as well, is a few times I have had someone say to me, I wish I had known more about grandma or grandma. I lost my grandparents when I was very, very young. So the only thing I have of them is memories, stories that my mother told or my father told. And I want to make sure that the younger generations have some of those pieces as well. What's your take on that?
Oh, I'm simpatico there. So let's see, there's seven children in the family, and then lots of grandchildren from two of them. And mom, I don't think mom really met. Mom met a couple of the grandchildren, but not all. And now there are 8, I think there's 8 great-grandchildren, and she certainly wouldn't have met any of them. My dad had met some, but not all. And what I see as the oldest looking at the pictures and looking at mannerisms and interests and things is how much I can see of my parents' physical characteristics in my brother and sister's kids and their kids.
Right.
There's a tilt of the head. There's an expression. There's an interest. And I can't help but think that's all part of what's going on in the life stream. And so to be able to say, I look at you and I see my mom, who you never met. And the reason I see that is because of something you said or the way that you said it. I so agree with you that there has got to be a way, take advantage of it, to say, I see in you some characteristic, some quality, some delight of a person that you've not met, but you're carrying their DNA because, there was never a time we were not. Right. Our DNA was always there going back. So here it is going forward. So do tell those. Do. And even if there's disagreement, because as the oldest of 7, I can say this is exactly how things go. I know it. But every person around that table who was present at that event has their take on it. And each of those takes are valid. So all of the stories should be invited so that the young ones know.
And generally my experience is that when one memory is shared, that usually results in some type of a chain reaction. Somebody else will say, remember. And it turns into such a fun conversation. And then all of a sudden, the generations are linked.
Yes.
There's that sense of family. There's that sense of connection between the generations. And, come on, let's face it. Isn't a conversation like that so much more fun than politics or religion? I mean, it's something that will carry us through the rest of our lives.
This is true.
What about writing your stories down? Now, I know some people decide they want to, I'm going to write a book, or they just journal. What about sharing those stories? Is there a time, a proper way to do that? Does that question even make sense?
It does. You're asking about the value of writing one's stories or memorializing them in some way. And then do you keep them in a book or on a little tape recorder digit thing, right. CD? Or do you find reasons to share those? And I think it's going to be individual to each person. The question becomes, what do you want to share? How come you want to share it? And to whom do you want to share? With whom?
Yeah.
With whom do you want to share it? And if you're going to share something deep and a little bit difficult, then the question becomes, have you done your work around that so your listener doesn't feel like they have to reach out and grab you?
Okay.
Some people do better recording their stories, are better at speaking than writing. Other people like to draw pictures and images and put it down that way. So I think that whatever mode of capturing comes easiest to you, capture as you're thinking about it.
Right.
Because we all think, okay, I'm going to do this tomorrow. Well, if we're lucky, tomorrow will come. Sometimes it's not. But to be thinking about it as legacy. And here's the thing. So many people say, I don't have any stories to tell, or nobody would listen to my stories. Well, it's nonsense, because we are multitudes. We are a multitude of stories, and our stories deserve to be shared and heard. That's what I would say.
I agree with
encourage.
That. 100% I agree with that. And dare I say that had I, in my moments of darkness, had I either gone to my laptop and sat at the keyboard, or had I taken a little tape recorder and just kind of talked to myself and verbalized those memories and then maybe played them back at some point, that might have helped too.
Yeah,
I think the way I did it probably benefited me far more.
Yeah.
But I want people to think of options you have when you are in that first phase of grief. You have a lot of options. And if you're lonely, one of the best things you can do is recall those memories, recall those stories that made you smile, that made you laugh, and that will renew the love that you have for the person you lost. Well, sadly, Diane, our time is winding down, and this is about the time that I actually turn the microphone over to my guests. So now it's going to be your turn to talk directly to the listeners without me directing your questions or interrupting with thoughts, otherwise controlling the conversation. So the floor is yours.
This has just been a deliciously nourishing conversation, Kathy. I know we could do this for forever. And I'm delighted Dave Roberts connected the two of us. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Connection and story.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. For my part, I have a podcast called Stories from Women Who Walk. It is on every platform going. We'll be hitting 5 years next April.
Wow.
And I've transitioned from interviews like this one to 60 seconds. So sometimes it's 2 minutes, but the idea is to give my listeners a little inspiration, motivation, encouragement. And Friday, this is important, Friday is always Story Prompt Friday. So I give you a little story background and a prompt to say, now you write that story. When I'm not doing that, I'm the principal behind Quarter Moon Story Arts. I invite you to check out the website, take a look at what's there, take a listen to what's there. My work is for women. I help women find the words they didn't know they had to tell their origin story, to nail an interview, to help their communication skills, and I think most importantly, to help bring out their voice, because we are born with a voice and our voice is our power. And as you've heard us today, telling stories is an expression of our power. And the more we can do that, I think the more we will shift attitudes, behaviors, consciousness, and even upset the status quo. So if anyone listening is interested in that, check it out. Take a listen, and you can reach out to me for a discovery chat. See if the project that you're working on is something that we can work on together. And I have a quick addendum to something you said, Kathy, about recording your thoughts. Just puke on the page. When I teach story, just puke on the page. Don't think about grammar, punctuation, writing a book. Get those stories down in whatever form comes to you. And that way you've got them there to create the magic and the comfort that Kathy was talking about.
Well, thank you. I've not heard that phrase, puke on the page. I've heard other phrases like that, but I love that one precisely because that's exactly the way some of my first pages have looked like in truth. Yeah. And I occasionally will teach a writing workshop myself. And one of the first things somebody says, I can't write, or I'll ask, why did you come to this workshop? I want to learn how to write. You know how to write because you know how to talk. And I'll talk, all writing is just you talking on the page. That's all it is. Start out with that. The power of storytelling to me is huge. Yeah. And I'm going to make a very bold statement, but one I bet all the money that I have, all my assets, everything, is that everybody has at least one story in them.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody has at least one story in them.
Oh, yeah.
And you should not determine or decide whether there's anyone out there interested in that story. It's not up to you. It's up to the listener to decide. For every author that writes a book, people will take that book. Some will like it and continue reading. Others will put it aside. But it's not for the author to determine who is going to pick up that book and read. And you would be surprised when you tell the story because it's in your own words. It's your memory, so that your personality, too, comes through that story. And your relationship in that story comes through. And the people listening to it generally are people that either know you or want to know more about. Someone said to me about my podcast, people aren't tuned into the podcast because of the title of the episode they see. That might start it, but they don't come back for that reason. They come back because of you. You, the storyteller, have made a connection, and that's why they come back. They come back for that relationship. So I know that storytelling is huge. I know personally that as it relates to grief, storytelling can be the key sometimes to you moving forward and to you finding happiness, because you need to find a way to change your life around your grief. I'll grieve till the day I die. I know that. I'll miss Tom until the day I die. But because I have been able to adapt my life, so to speak, my routines, everything I've done, I've kind of redefined myself. And I have said, and I will say again today, I am the happiest now at this point in my life than I have ever been. So a lot of that relates to storytelling, because you know what? I love to talk, in case you haven't picked that up yet. So listeners, you need to take care of yourselves. I tell you that every week as well. And one of the ways you can take care of yourselves is to keep those memories alive. But please, please, please share them with others. And if you don't feel you have anyone to share them with, write them down. Send them to me. I'd love to read them. I'd love to hear your memories. Reach out to Diane, and maybe you'll find a fascinating new way to tell your story, or turn it into a project. Many of us have that capability as well. The book that went out there in 2013, Memoirs of a Carny Ticket Seller, is out there only because my two daughters wanted that story, that section, that 3-year period of our life. They wanted that in a tangible form. It's the only reason it's out there, but I had so much fun doing it. And I love picking it back up and reading it every so often again. I'm that greedy. Okay, listeners, must run. I know. You've been so patient, and thanks so much for listening. Diane's contact information, as always, with our guests, will be in the podcast notes, will be on our website. And I just know that if you reach out to Diane, just start by going to her website and then hit that contact button and reach out to her. Your life will be so enriched, just as mine is enriched every time I do one of these episodes. So until next week, take care. We love you, and just keep going as we all continue to live and grieve. Thank you so much, Diane, for being with me.
Amen, Kathy. Amen.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveandgrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.